Seeing Syrian Crisis Through Russian Eyes. Ray McGovern, October 29, 2015. Information Clearinghouse. Consortium News. Quote, "To jaw is always better than to war," as Sir Winston Churchill put it at a White House luncheon on June 1954. The aphorism applies in spades today, as the U.S., Russia, and other key countries involved in troubles in Syria decide whether to jaw or to war. Russia's recent military intervention in Syria could open up new possibilities for those working for a negotiated solution, or not. There does seem to be considerable overlap in U.S. and Russian interests and objectives. For instance, both sides say they want to suppress terrorism, including the Islamic State, also known as ISIL, ISIS, or Daesh, and Al-Qaeda's affiliate, the Nusra Front. And both the U.S. and Russia talk about the need for political reconciliation among Syria's disparate religious and ethnic groups. The chief disagreement is over the future of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, whether he, quote, must go, as U.S. officials insist, or whether the issue should be left to the ballots of the Syrian people, the view favored by Russia. Yet, what happens in the next week or so, whether it turns out to be a belated jaw or an escalated war, will have a significant effect on bilateral U.S.-Russian relations, as well as developments in Syria, Iraq, and the whole neighborhood, which now includes Europe, because of the destabilizing flow of refugees. So I think it makes sense for me to undertake what we did at some of the best moments inside the CIA's analytical branch, view a crisis from where the other side stood, and thus project how an adversary, or a friend, might react to a U.S. initiative. A common trap in intelligence analysis is mirror imaging, assuming that others, whether adversaries or friends, look at facts and intentions the same way we do. It can be helpful to step into the other side's shoes and consider how its leaders are likely to see us. I make a stab at that below. In what follows, I imagine myself working within Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, Russia's CIA equivalent, in the analysis office responsible for preparing the president's daily brief for President Vladimir Putin. I further imagine that his daily brief resembles what the U.S. intelligence community prepares for the U.S. president. So I patterned the item below after the now declassified PDB for President George W. Bush that on August 6, 2001, famously warned him, quote, bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. In my paper, intelligence assessments are presented in italics. The President's Daily Brief, October 28, 2015, re-Syria, Obama trying to fend off U.S. hawks. President Obama is under severe pressure from senior military and intelligence officials and Congress to raise the ante in Syria. Yesterday, Washington's Post lead story sourced to unnamed U.S. officials reported that Obama is considering Pentagon proposals to, quote, put U.S. troops closer to front lines in Iraq and Syria. Diplomats at our embassy in Washington note that this kind of story often reflects decisions already made and about to be formally announced. In this particular case, however, the embassy thinks it at least equally likely that the Post is being used by officials who favor more aggressive military action in order to put pressure on the president. During Obama's first year in office, senior military leaders used the media to make it extremely difficult for Obama to turn down leaked Pentagon proposals to surge troops into Afghanistan. Yesterday, Senator John McCain, the Republican chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, used a Senate hearing to ridicule administration policy on Syria and grill Defense Secretary Ashton Carter and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Joseph Dunford on the policy's embarrassing failings. Carter said attacks against ISIL in Syria and Iraq would increase, including, quote, direct action on the ground. But Dunford admitted, quote, the balance of forces now are in Assad's advantage. Facing heavy criticism for indecisiveness, Obama still seems reluctant to put many more U.S. Army or, quote, moderate rebel boots into the quagmire that he warned us against when we began our airstrikes. He would also wish to avoid the kind of destructive attacks that would pour still more Syrian refugees into Europe. We do not think occasional direct action on the ground will change much. Indeed, a White House spokesman reiterated yesterday that the administration has, quote, no intentions of long-term ground combat. As for the no-fly zone advocated by McCain and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, Secretary Carter said, quote, we have not made that recommendation to the president, adding the obligatory caveat, quote, he hasn't taken it off the table. Dunford added, quote, from a military perspective, we can impose a no-fly zone. Diplomacy. We continue to believe that Obama prefers to regard this past month's events in Syria as an opportunity to bring the main players to the negotiating table rather than the battlefield. Defense Secretary Carter called attention to talks later this week in Vienna in which Secretary of State John Kerry will be engaged that are, quote, precisely aimed at the contours of political settlement. The big news here is that Kerry has dropped the U.S. objection to having Iran, a supporter of the Assad regime, participate. As for Kerry, unlike his behavior in late summer 2013 and in early 2014, he seems to be following the president's instructions to negotiate an end to the conflict and to the misery in Syria. Emerging on Friday from contentious talks with the Saudi and Turkish foreign ministers, as well as Foreign Minister Lavrov, Kerry sounded a hopeful note. Quote, diplomacy has a way of working through very difficult issues that seem to be absolutely contradictory. But if we can get into a political process, then sometimes these things have a way of resolving themselves. At the Senate hearing, Defense Secretary Carter called for an early political transition in Syria, but was careful to add, quote, the structures of the Syrian state are going to be important to the future, and we don't want them to dissolve entirely. The U.S. approach to removing Assad has been mostly a political effort. At which point, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican South Carolina, a close ally of Senator McCain, complained bitterly, quote, Assad is as secure as the day is long, adding, quote, you have turned Syria over to Russia and Iran. Yeah, the vitriol of McCain and Graham is no surprise. We want to make sure you know something about a relatively new player, JCS Chairman Joseph Dunford, who chose at his confirmation hearing on July 9, 2015, to let the world know that he is an unreconstructed Cold Warrior. Quote, if you want to talk about a nation that could pose an existential threat to the United States, I'd have to point to Russia, Dunford said. If you look at their behavior, it's nothing short of alarming. Dunford added that he thought it reasonable to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. Dunford took up his new duties at an inauspicious moment, the day after we began launching airstrikes against terrorist targets in Syria. Suffice it to say that, for the U.S. military and CIA, October has been one of the most humiliating months since the inglorious U.S. departure from Vietnam. It is important to bear that in mind. We think that it serves to double the pressure on President Obama to let loose the military on Syria and Iraq, as pushed by most of the corporate media that are attacking Obama for weakness and indecision. You will recall that he faced the same challenge in August 2013 when he came very close to letting himself be mousetrapped into a major attack on Syria with U.S. forces. A special danger. This time there is a new, quite delicate element of which you need to be aware, the so-called, quote, moderate rebels, whom the U.S., primarily the CIA, trained, equipped, and inserted into Syria. This issue came up at the Senate Armed Services Committee meeting yesterday when Chairman McCain expressed particular concern for pro-U.S. Syrian rebels he said are now being bombed by Russia and Syria. Defense Secretary Carter replied that, quote, no rebel group directly supported by the Defense Department under the law had been attacked. Casting a look of incredulity, McCain replied, quote, I promise you they have. This is particularly sore spot for McCain and his CIA friends 10 days into our airstrike campaign. Another Washington Post lead story with the headline, Early signs of Russian intent strikes seemed to catch White House flat-footed, claimed that Russian aircraft pounded CIA-sponsored moderate rebel groups, who appeared to get no warning that they were in Russian jets' crosshairs. U.S. officials told the Post, quote, CIA Director John Brennan has voiced frustration with U.S. inaction as fighters trained and armed by the agency at camps in Jordan over the past 2 years face a Russia assault. CIA officials do not like to be seen as leaving their own in the lurch, whether in the mountains of Syria or on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. Many serious scholars who have investigated the assassination of President John F. Kennedy conclude that Allen Dulles, who was fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, led a cabal that killed him, and then sat on the Warren Commission to cover it all up. We doubt that John Brennan is up to playing that kind of role, or that Dunford, for example, could be persuaded to do what a Marine predecessor, General Smedley Butler, refused to do: join a coup against a sitting U.S. president. In Butler's case, he rejected a right-wing scheme to remove President Franklin Roosevelt from office, but there is reason to think that Obama believes he has more to fear than the fate of his policies. One report alleges that he privately told friends of his fear of ending up like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Damn it. And some, Kennedy has ample reason to be afraid that powerful people in establishment Washington, convinced they know better than he how to protect the country, might succeed in pinning on his back a too soft on the Russians bullseye. Putin makes Obama an offer he can't refuse. Mike Whitney, October 30, 2015. Information Clearinghouse. Counterpunch. Why is John Kerry so eager to convene an emergency summit on Syria now, when the war has been dragging on for 4.5 years? Is he worried that Russia's air campaign is wiping out too many U.S.-backed jihadis and sabotaging Washington's plan to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad? You bet he is. No one who's been following events in Syria for the last 3 weeks should have any doubt about what's really going on. Russia has been methodically wiping out Washington's mercenaries on the ground, while recapturing large swaths of land that had been lost to the terrorists. That, in turn, has strengthened Assad's position in Damascus and left the administration's policies in tatters. And that's why Kerry wants another meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov pronto, even though the two diplomats met less than a week ago. The Secretary of State is hoping to cobble together some kind of a makeshift deal that will stop the killing and salvage what's left of Uncle Sam's threadbare Syrian project. On Tuesday, Reuters reported that Iran had been invited to the confab, which will be held in Vienna on Thursday. The announcement is bound to be ferociously criticized on Capitol Hill, but it just shows to what extent Russia is currently setting the agenda. It was Lavrov who insisted that Iran be invited, and it was Kerry who reluctantly capitulated. Moscow is now in the driver's seat. And don't be surprised if the summit produces some pretty shocking results, too, like a dramatic 180 on Washington's Assad must go demand. As Putin has pointed out many times before, Assad's not going anywhere. He's going to be a part of Syria's transitional governing body, when the Obama team finally agrees to the Geneva Communique, which is the political track that will eventually end the fighting, restore security, and allow millions of refugees to return to their homes. What's left of them. The reason the administration is going to agree to allow Assad to stay is because if they don't, the Russian Air Force is going to continue to blow U.S.-backed mercenaries to smithereens. So, you see, Obama really has no choice in the matter. Putin has put a gun to his head and made him an offer he can't refuse. That doesn't mean the war is going to be a cakewalk for Russia or its allies. It won't be. In fact, there have already been some major setbacks, like the fact that ISIS just seized a critical section of the Aleppo-Khan Yunis highway, cutting off the government's supply lines to Aleppo. This is a serious problem, but it is not a problem that can't be overcome, nor is it a problem that will affect the outcome of the war. It's just one of the obstacles that has to be dealt with and surpassed. Taking a broader view, the outlook is much more encouraging for the Russian-led coalition, which continues to cut off supply lines, blow up ammo dumps and fuel depots, and rapidly eviscerate the ability of the enemy to wage war. So, while the war is certainly not a cakewalk in the park, there's no doubt about who's going to win. And that might explain why the U.S. decided to bomb Aleppo's main power plant last week, plunging the entire city into darkness, because Obama wants to rubblize everything on his way out. Keep in mind that the local water treatment plants require electrical power, so by blowing up the plant, Obama has condemned tens of thousands of civilians to cholera and other waterborne diseases. Apparently, our hospital nuking president isn't bothered by such trivial matters as killing women and children. Now check this out from the Daily Star. Quote, U.S.-led coalition forces in Iraq and Syria carried out a large-scale attack on Syria's Omar oil field as part of its mission to target ISIS's ability to generate money, a coalition spokesman said Thursday. Operations Officer Major Michael Falanowski told journalists in Baghdad that airstrikes late Wednesday struck ISIS-controlled oil refineries, command and control centers, and transportation nodes in the Omar oil field, near the town of Deir el-Zaur. Coalition spokesman Colonel Stephen Warren said the attack hit 26 targets, making one of the largest set of strikes since launching the air campaign last year. The refinery generates between $1.7 and $5.1 million per month for ISIS. It was very specific targets that would result in long-term incapacitation of their ability to sell oil, to get it out of the ground and transport it, Falanowski said. ISIS seized a number of oil refineries and other infrastructure in Iraq and Syria as it sought to generate revenue to build a self-sufficient state. U.S.-led forces strike ISIS-controlled oil field in Syria. Daily Star. Isn't it amazing how, after a year of combing the desert looking for ISIS targets, the U.S. Air Force finally figures out where the goddamn oil refineries are? No wonder the Western media chose to ignore this story. One can only conclude that Obama never had any intention of cutting off ISIS's main funding stream, oil sales. What he really wanted was for the terrorist group to flourish, provided it helped Washington achieve its strategic goals. Putin even pointed this out in a recent interview. He said, excerpt, quote, the mercenaries occupy the oil fields in Iraq and Syria. They start extracting the oil, and the oil is purchased by somebody. Where are the sanctions on the parties purchasing this oil? Do you believe the U.S. does not know who's buying it? Is it not their allies who are buying the oil from ISIS? Do you not think the U.S. has the power to influence their allies? Or is the point that they don't wish to influence them? Putin was never taken in by the whole ISIS oil charade. He knew it was a farce from the get-go ever since Financial Times published their thoroughly laughable article on the topic, which claimed that ISIS had its own group of headhunters offering, quote, competitive salaries to engineers with the, quote, requisite experience, and encouraged, quote, prospective employees to apply to its Human Resources Department. The ISIS Human Resources Department Have you ever read anything more ridiculous in your life? Read the whole story here. In an interview with NPR, FT fantasist Erica Solomon, who wrote the article, explained why the U.S. could not bomb the oil fields or refineries. Here's what she said, quote, "What ISIS has done is managed to corner control of the extraction process, which is smart because they can't get bombed there. It would cause a natural disaster, so they extract the oil and then they immediately sell it to local traders, any average person who can buy a truck and then fill it with a tank of oil." Well, that sure didn't stop Major Michael Falinowski now, did it? He seems to have blown up those ISIS refineries without batting an eye, which just proves that Solomon's natural disaster fairy tale is pure bunkum. But if it was all baloney, then why did the U.S. Air Force decide to hit the targets now? What changed? Here's a clue from an article that popped up on RT just one day before the attacks. Quote, "Russia's airplanes cut off routes used by Islamic State, ISIS, formerly ISIL, to deliver supplies to Syria from Iraq by bombing a bridge over the Euphrates River," the Russian General Staff said. The bridge over the Euphrates River, near the Syrian city of Deir el-Zor, was a key point of the logistics chain of IS. Today, Russian pilots carried out a surgical strike against the object. The deputy chief of the General Staff of Russia, Colonel General Andrei Kartopolov, said on Thursday during a news briefing, adding that the terrorist group's armament and ammunition delivery route had been cut off. Russian Air Force cuts off ISIS supply lines by bombing bridge over Euphrates, RT. There it is. The Russians blow up a critical bridge over the Euphrates, making oil transport impossible, and the next thing you know, bam, the U.S. goes into scorched earth mode, leveling everything in sight. Coincidence? Not bloody likely. The whole incident suggests the mighty CIA is rolling up its pet project in Syria and heading for the exits. It's worth noting that ISIS has never been a self-sustaining corporate franchise netting over $1 million a day on oil receipts, as Western propaganda would have one believe. That's all part of the public relations cover-up used to conceal the fact that the Gulf allies and probably CIA black ops are funding these homicidal maniacs. In any event, the Russian intervention is forcing Washington to rethink its Syria policy, while Kerry is bending over backwards to end the fighting. Obama is busy tweaking the policy in a way that appeases his critics on the right without provoking a confrontation with Moscow. It's a real tight-wire act, but the White House PR team thinks they can pull it off. Check this out from NBC News. Quote, "Defense Secretary Ash Carter today revealed that the U.S. will openly begin direct action on the ground against ISIS forces in Iraq and Syria in his testimony before the Armed Services Committee on Tuesday. Carter said, quote, "We won't hold back from supporting capable partners in opportunistic attacks against ISIL or conducting such mission directly, whether by strikes from the air or direct action on the ground." Secretary Carter, U.S. to begin direct action on the ground in Iraq, Syria, NBC News. This sounds a lot worse than it is. The truth is, Obama has no stomach for the type of escalation the hawks, like Hillary Clinton and John McCain, are demanding. There aren't going to be any safe zones or no-fly zones or any other provocations which would risk a bloody conflagration with Moscow. What Obama is looking for is the best face-saving strategy available that will allow him to retreat without incurring the wrath of the Washington warmongers. It's a tall order, but SecDef Ash Carter has come up with a plan that might just do the trick. This is from The Hill. Quote, Defense Secretary Ash Carter on Tuesday described new ways the U.S. military plans to increase pressure on the Islamic State and in Iraq and Syria after months of criticism that the administration is not doing enough to defeat the terrorist group. The changes we're pushing can be described by what I call the 3 R's: Raqqa, Ramadi, and Raids, Carter testified the Senate Armed Services Committee. First, Carter said the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS plans to support modern Syrian forces to go after Raqqa, the terrorist group's stronghold and administration capital. The secretary also said he hopes to pursue a new way of equipping the Syrian Arab coalition, which consists of about a dozen groups. Quote, while the old approach was to train and equip completely new forces outside of Syria before sending them into the fight, the new approach is to work with the vetted leaders of groups that are already fighting ISIL and provide equipment and some training to them and support their operations with air power, he said. Yeah, big change. He also said the coalition expects to intensify its air campaign with additional U.S. and coalition aircraft and to target IS with a higher and heavier rate of strikes. Quote, this will include more strikes against ISIL, high-value targets as our intelligence improves, and also its oil enterprise, which is a critical pillar of ISIL's financial infrastructure, Carter said, using a different acronym for ISIS. Pentagon chief unveils new plan for ISIS fight, The Hill. See anything new here? It's a big nothing burger, right? They're going to kill more high-value targets. Big whoop. That's always been the game plan, hasn't it? Of course it has. What this shows is that Obama is just running out the clock, hoping he can keep this mess on the back burner until he's out of office and working out the terms of his first big book deal. The last thing he wants is to get embroiled in a spitting match with the Kremlin his final year in office. Unfortunately, the problem Obama is going to encounter is that Putin can't simply turn off the war machine with the flip of a switch. It took Moscow a long time to decide to intervene in Syria, just like it took a long time to marshal the forces that would be deployed, build the coalition, and draft the battle plan. The Russians don't take war lightly, and now that they've put the ball into motion, they're not going to stop until the job is done and the bulk of the terrorists have been exterminated. That means there's not going to be a ceasefire in the immediate future. Putin needs to demonstrate that once Moscow commits its forces, it will persevere until it achieves victory. That victory could come in the form of liberating Aleppo and a subsequent sealing off of the Turkish-Syria border, or he might have some other goal in mind. But it's a matter of credibility as much as anything. If Putin falls back, hesitates, or shows even the slightest lack of resolve, Russia will see it as a sign of weakness and try to exploit it. So Putin has no choice but to see this thing through to the bitter end. At the very least, he needs to prove to Washington that when Russia gets involved, Russia wins. That's a message Washington needs to hear.